You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
Now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. My friend, our mutual friend, Gart Simons, for the past 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, said, you got to put Martin Indyk, the Ambassador Martin Indyk, on your show. And I said, yes, yes, yes. So finally, we have the privilege of having him on. He's written a book called Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle East Diplomacy. But he's a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a former United States ambassador to Israel, Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. He was a special assistant to President Clinton. He's been involved in the Middle Eastern negotiations, including having served as President Obama's special envoy for the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations from July 2013 to June 2014. And through the context of Henry Kissinger, he covers all bases. Welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Zev. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So what made you decide that you want to focus on the Middle East, but use Henry Kissinger as the springboard?
Well, Middle East has been my passion, you could say my noble obsession, since I was a teenager, and actually went to Israel for the second time to make Aliyah back in 1973, and the Yom Kippur War broke out. And I watched as Henry Kissinger in those days brokered a ceasefire and then started the whole peace process that led to the United States dominated order in the region and the American-led peace process. I then, fast forward, became involved in it myself, as you said in the introduction. But at the end of that last stint for Secretary Kerry and President Obama, when we failed yet again at the effort to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through a 9-month negotiation that we had then, which, by the way, is the last time that there's been any final status negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians, I decided that I needed to go back to where it all began and try to learn something from Henry Kissinger, the master diplomat, on how to and how not to make peace in the Middle East. Because he, after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, brokered 2 Israel-Egypt agreements, one agreement between Israel and Syria, that really laid the foundations for everything else that came afterwards, from the Israel-Egypt Peace Treaty to the Oslo Accords, the Israel-Jordan Treaty, and so on. So it was basically...
He mastered shuttle diplomacy. That was his big thing.
Exactly.
But is shuttle diplomacy better than face-to-face?
Well, as it turned out, sorry for my dog, it was more successful than we had been. And of course, in those days, countries had just been to war, and there was no possibility of getting them to sit down together and negotiate face to face. That came a lot later. But Kissinger was just basically being the shadchan, the broker, the honest broker between, in the first instance, Golda Meir and Anwar Sadat of Egypt, and then with Hafez al-Assad and Golda Meir. Subsequently, as I write in the book, he also negotiated with Yitzhak Rabin when he was prime minister the first time, and Shimon Peres was his hawkish defense minister. So it's a rich tale of amazing doings by Kissinger on the high roads of Middle East diplomacy.
Henry Kissinger, 98 years old. I learned in your book that I knew that Henry Kissinger grew up Orthodox and his parents were Orthodox. I didn't realize that they were part of the Good Israel of Germany.
Indeed. He and his father were members of Aguda, which was anti-Zionist at that time, though I don't think that really had much influence on him, on his attitude towards Israel. But yeah, when he came to the United States fleeing the Nazis, just with his father and mother and brother, he was in an Orthodox community here. He married an Orthodox woman in an Orthodox synagogue. So he was the full bottle, you could say. But when he joined the U.S. Army and went back to Germany during the war, it's then that he essentially gave up on his faith, gave up on believing that there was a just God, and hasn't practiced since then. But he remains, he identifies as a Jew. He remains an ethnic Jew, and one of the interesting things that I wrote about in the book is that before he went into government as Nixon's national security advisor, 1969, he had made 6 trips to Israel, which in those days was a lot, if you think about it, back to then. And he had never made a trip to anywhere in the Arab world, never set foot in the Arab world until after the 1973 Yom Kippur War.
Wow. Now, you write in your book that Henry Kissinger, well, you consulted with him. Did he like the fact that you're writing the book? Was he happy with you when the book came out?
Well, he was very keen for me to write the book. And that's because, Kissinger is a fairly controversial statesman to this day for Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Chile, Bangladesh, and so on. And he's remembered for détente with the Soviet Union and, of course, the opening to China. But his Middle East diplomacy, which he spent 4 years as Secretary of State engaged in, has gotten very little attention. And maybe that's because he was successful at it, and he was really, in the day, he was a huge celebrity because of his shuttle diplomacy, as you may recall. But it really didn't get much attention. There's never been any real study done of it. So that was one of the reasons why I decided to go and do it. As to what he thought about it, well, as I say, he cooperated with it. I interviewed him at least 12 times. We had many conversations informally. He didn't like the way that I portrayed him as manipulative. I tried to explain to him that that's exactly the point. That's the art of diplomacy that I wanted to emphasize, the way in which he was so successful at getting leaders to go to places they didn't want to go and make them feel like they wanted to go there. And he was indeed the master of that game. But in the end, he ended up quite happy about it. He says now it's an excellent book. And I think that's because a lot of people told him how well he came out of it. I want to emphasize it's not a hagiography, and I'm quite critical of him in various places. But overall...
But people are critical of him during the time with Richard Nixon. It was a very complicated relationship because Nixon made some, I don't believe it was anti-Semitic, but he made anti-Semitic remarks. So let's look at first how Henry Kissinger navigated dealing with the president who didn't like liberal Jews, and he blamed them for the Vietnam War.
And he didn't like what he regarded as the Jewish-controlled media. I kind of disagree with you a little bit, Zev. I think he was basically anti-Semitic.
But he saved Israel in just a moment.
But whatever the distinctions we make, he subjected Kissinger to an anti-Semitic jibes, and I mean the whole essence of the way he dealt with Kissinger at the beginning is indicative. He told Kissinger he wanted him to work with him on all of the issues around the world, all of the big issues, except the Middle East. Why? Because he told Kissinger he didn't believe he could be objective when it came to Israel. And so he excluded Kissinger from dealing with the Middle East. That, of course, was like a red rag to a bull for Kissinger, and he spent 3 years maneuvering to get control, and eventually did get control of the Middle East portfolio as well. But he was constantly on the defensive because Nixon suspected his loyalties.
Now, was Henry Kissinger, did he, we'll talk about it right now, but the fact that didn't Henry Kissinger not want to save Israel during the Yom Kippur War? And it was Nixon who did it?
I think, yes, number one, Nixon's decision to send everything, as he said.
Because Henry Kissinger, Nixon, he didn't want that to go to the weaponry.
So I don't want to take away from Nixon's decision. It was critically important. But Kissinger's got a bad rap for what happened there. And so I think, first of all, you need to understand that at the beginning of the war, the assumption in Israel and in Washington was that the Israelis would clean up, would go on the counteroffensive and clean up the Arab offensives very quickly. And the Israelis didn't tell Kissinger, didn't tell the world, didn't tell anybody, didn't tell their own citizens for 3 days how bad the situation was. I was in Israel at the time, so I remember on the third day, the third night, we finally found out that the Egyptians had crossed the canal and the Syrians had gotten to the ridgeline before they were pushed back. So that was the environment that he was working in at first. Then the Israelis came in and said, Gewalt, we've got lost so many tanks and so many aircraft, we need resupply. And Kissinger started the resupply process, but he tried to do it in a way that would not trigger an Arab oil embargo, which was not an unreasonable concern, because as soon as Nixon ordered it, there was an Arab oil embargo, which plunged the world into a global recession. So, that's how it started. When Kissinger found out that the Israeli offensives that had then been launched were being held up because of a lack of supply, that's when he went out and pressed the Pentagon to do what was necessary to get the stuff. And he did that because he needed Israel's offensives to prevail in order to get the Arabs to accept the ceasefire that he was trying to negotiate. The use of force by Israel was critical to his diplomacy. And so he definitely was not interested in Israel losing. The difference was that when they went to Nixon, Nixon had the authority to order the Pentagon to move everything, to get everything moving. And as soon as that happened, Kissinger rode herd on the Pentagon and the bureaucracy, and Kissinger was responsible, together with Schlesinger, the defense secretary, for getting the material to Israel.
We're speaking with former Ambassador Martin Indyk, a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, a former, as I mentioned, ambassador to Israel. He's worked for President Obama, other presidents dealing with the Middle East. His fascinating book is called Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle East Diplomacy. Mr. Ambassador, I had spoken a number of months ago with Roger Stone, and I just want to play what he said about what happened between Henry Kissinger and the president. Here's Roger Stone.
As you know, in 1973, at Yom Kippur, the Israelis, in a very rare failure of their intelligence, find that the Egyptians and the Syrians have launched an extraordinary attack, and their backs are against the sea. They are completely taken by surprise, and they are swiftly running out of both lethal aid, and I should say they need both medicine and bullets, to put it mildly. And they appeal to the United States. Nixon hears all sides, and Henry Kissinger is stoutly against doing anything to help Israel in this moment of peril. He says it will trigger the Russians, Mr. President. You can't risk it. Admiral Thomas Moorer is also opposed. He says that he can get the aid, he can airdrop what Golda Meir is asking for, but it would take, as he says, 48 hours. And Nixon tells him to go. So there is a tape that they never play. It's Nixon who calls him after 24 hours and says, "So I assume the stuff is on its way to Golda." He says, "Well, no, sir, not really. We haven't chosen the aircraft yet." Because Kissinger told Moorer to stall, as they hoped to talk Nixon out of this. Nixon went out of his mind, and he said, "I don't really care about the Russians." He says to Moorer, "If those planes," he said, "send anything that can fly," he says. "If those planes are not in the air in the next 2 hours, I'm going to come over there personally and put my foot up your ass." That can be found. So he was.
Is that on the tape? Is that on the tape?
I mean, he did. He basically decided to airlift what Israel needed, over the objections of Kissinger, over the objections of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, over the objections of the entire National Security Council. He did the right thing at the right time.
He saved Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Is that all on tape, that whole conversation that you quoted?
The Moore conversation is one of the ones that it exists, but it is rarely transcribed. A lot of the Nixon tapes have not been transcribed.
So there's Roger Stone. Your reaction to Roger Stone?
Well, look, there's a huge amount of documentation. I've gone through it all, including the tapes. And this is just made up out of whole cloth. In the book, I detail what actually happened. Kissinger did not oppose it. And Mora was not the key. It was Schlesinger that Nixon told to get moving. So, I think the documents show a very different story to what Roger Stone tells here. Kissinger did come into Nixon and say, let's send 3 C-5As, the big ones. And Nixon said, to his credit, he said, Henry, we'll get blamed for 3 or for 30. So let's send everything that flies. And that was Nixon's decision. It was his contribution, something, by the way, he was very proud of. And it did make a difference. There's no doubt about it. But there's no evidence whatsoever that Kissinger opposed it. On the contrary, as I said, it didn't serve his strategy for Israel not to be able to prosecute the war.
Now, a lot of Jews who are more nationalistic, right-wing, Orthodox, don't really like Henry Kissinger. They call his shuttle diplomacy salami-style tactics, where he felt cutting off Israel piece by piece by piece. I'm sure you heard that during the course of your research and during the time that it happened.
Right. Well, look, Kissinger was very unpopular with, as you say, the right wing in Israel. There were huge demonstrations back in 1975. Earlier on in these first negotiations, it was a different story because the Israelis really wanted to bring the soldiers home, wanted to get the POWs back. Kissinger was instrumental in getting the return of the POWs. So he started off very popular. But by 1975, when he was pressing Rabin to give up the strategic Sinai passes in Sinai and the oil fields in Sinai, there was huge opposition to him in Israel, and indeed in the American Jewish community here. And all I can say about that is, let's judge it by results. Had he not persuaded Rabin to give up the passes and the oil fields, there wouldn't be a peace treaty with Egypt, in which Menachem Begin, the hero of the right wing, gave up all of Sinai. All that Kissinger pressed Rabin to give up was 1/3 of Sinai. So I think that people who take the view that Israel shouldn't give up any territory need to take into account that is a recipe for continued conflict. And Kissinger's approach, which was step by step, which was only getting Israel, he was determined not to let Nixon impose the 1967 borders on Israel, which Nixon wanted to do. Instead, he insisted on this step-by-step process. Salami tactics, you could describe it that way. But in fact, it was designed to ask of Israel things that it could do. He judged that there was no way that Israel could handle a full-scale withdrawal of the 67 borders, like Eisenhower had insisted on in 56.
And Eisenhower admitted he made a mistake by pressuring Israel. Later on in the 1960s, he wrote that he made a mistake trying to pressure Israel.
But I'm just saying, there was a precedent for that. Kissinger developed a completely different approach, which was incremental. And the reason he developed the incremental approach, the step-by-step approach, is because he did not believe the Arabs were ready to end the conflict with Israel. And he did not believe that Israel was strong enough to meet Arab requirements. And so instead, his whole approach was to give Israel a chance to build its strength with American support and end its isolation, so that at the point where the Arabs were actually ready to end the conflict, Israel would be strong enough to make the territorial concessions necessary to achieve peace. I think that's a better approach to Israel's dilemmas, which has proved itself over 30 years of peace with Egypt, than the alternative, which would have been to hold on to the territory and have never-ending wars.
Our guest is Martin Indyk, Distinguished Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations, former United States Ambassador to Israel. He's worked with President Obama, Bill Clinton, and he's written a book called Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle East Diplomacy. Now, the Sinai wasn't as much attachment emotionally for Israel as, let's say, Judea and Samaria. Same thing with Gaza. Israel pulled out of Gaza, got nothing for it, really, except terrorism and Hamas. Even at the White Plantation Agreement, you're right about that, too. Israel was prepared to give major concessions, major chunks of land, and Yasser Arafat rejected it. In fact, Bill Clinton was upset at him for doing so. So the idea of land for peace, especially when it comes to the Palestinian Arabs, is a whole different situation than the Golan or Sinai, because we see what's happening, and they don't want that. It's a whole different mechanism. So I'm not sure I don't believe that land for peace with the Palestinians works in the same way as it did with Egypt or even with Syria.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Kissinger wasn't around for that.
Right. I mentioned, the White Plantation, that you were involved, but not him, right?
Yeah. So the White Plantation, I think if I can say, Zev, you're confusing the White Plantation and Camp David. White Plantation was one in which, negotiated in which Netanyahu gave up 13% of the West Bank. And then his government collapsed after that. The Camp David was when Barak offered 96%.
Right. I meant to say right.
Of the West.
Right. Uh-huh.
And Arafat said no. And indeed, Israel has made a number of offers like that. Olmert did a similar thing. And again, the Palestinians did not accept it. These were generous offers. They weren't everything that the Palestinians were demanding. That's the nature of negotiations, to produce compromises. So yes, in a sense, it has been a failure, which was part of the reason which was the real reason why I went back to try to understand Kissinger's approach. But Kissinger's approach is very interesting, and now I'm going to say something which I'm sure you won't agree with, but I believe it to be the way to deal with the Palestinian problem. By the way, having tried the alternative, I was there at Camp David. I was there with Kerry when we came up with the Kerry principles, and Abu Mazen wouldn't even respond to those. But Kissinger's approach, the step-by-step incremental approach, did not assume that the Arabs were ready to make peace with Israel, to end their conflict with Israel. And Rabin, even though Rabin and Kissinger had this knockdown, drag-out fight over the Sinai, when it came to the Palestinians, when Rabin was elected as prime minister the second time, what did he do? He introduced Oslo, which was a step-by-step process. Israel was to withdraw in 3 phases from the West Bank and Gaza, but there was no timetable for it, and there was nothing in the Oslo Accords about a Palestinian state, about Jerusalem, or about refugees. Simply not mentioned, nor the 67 lines. So Rabin's approach was exactly Kissinger's design, where you put it off until later because the Palestinians aren't ready for it, and you try to build an incremental process involving building trust and confidence that enables both sides eventually to achieve what they want. Very different approach.
But how's it going to work, Mr. Ambassador?
Well, no, just a minute. Rabin was assassinated.
And he was ready to change his mind at the time of his assassination to this.
No,
That's
No,
what some of the historians say.
that's not true. Rabin was assassinated. His last speech was one in which he first of all, he never spoke about a Palestinian state, and it wasn't in the Oslo Accords. But he talked about a federation between the Palestinian entity, he said, and Jordan. That was his vision in the last speech he made. Everybody cites the fact that he gave a Knesset speech in which he said that, there won't be a Palestinian state, we won't give up Jerusalem. He never agreed to any of those things in the Oslo Accords. They're not there if you go and look at it. What happened was Rabin was assassinated, Peres was defeated, Netanyahu took over and dragged his feet for 18 months, eventually gave up 13% of the West Bank as part of that interim step-by-step process of Oslo, and then his government was brought down. Then Barak was elected, and what did Barak do? He came to Washington and he told Clinton, let's go to Camp David, let's end the conflict. Let's take Arafat there and we'll put him to the test. I'll make a generous offer and either he'll accept it or we'll unmask him. Do you remember that? We'll unmask him. And because Clinton was in his last year, Barak was insisting, we schlepped Arafat to Camp David. He did not want to go, but we schlepped him there. And all he was doing was looking for a way to get out without accepting what he understood was what Barak and Clinton would impose on him. That was never part of the Oslo design. Never. The Oslo design was a Kissingerian, step-by-step incremental process with the outcome undefined and no assumption that the Palestinians would be ready in any short time frame to end the conflict. And yet Barak was the one who insisted on an end of conflict, end of claims agreement. And we went along with him. And the whole thing blew up. So, everybody says Oslo is a terrible thing. In its original conception, the way that Rabin was handling it, it was not a terrible thing. It was a process that might have worked. Of course, we don't know because he was assassinated. But just, it's important to understand what actually happened as opposed to what everybody says now occurred.
Well, now, today, first of all, I was curious to get your perceptions of various Israeli prime ministers, or your opinions of Bibi Netanyahu and Barak and Rabin and Shimon Peres.
Well, Rabin is the one that I admire most because of his ability to read the map analytically. He was brilliant analytically and courageous in his determination to try to resolve the conflict with the Palestinians in his own way and in his own time. Tragically, he didn't get the opportunity to finish the job. Netanyahu, he and I have many hours together. I was ambassador when he was prime minister the first time, and of course I worked closely with him subsequent to that, after Rabin's assassination and his victory over Peres. He's a very smart man. But I think that he was always challenged by this dilemma. I have this image of Netanyahu as when he looks in the mirror in the morning, he's got this little Netanyahu, little Bibi on one shoulder that says, Bibi, you're the man who can do it. You're the only one who can do it. You're the one who's going to make peace. And then there's this other Bibi, the politician, who says to him, don't you dare. The last time you tried that was at the White Plantation, brought your government down. Don't do it. And in the end, Bibi the politician won out over Bibi the statesman. And he was never prepared to take the risks involved and it is a risky business, to try to move forward in the peace process because of the searing experience he had when he tried it the first time. So for me, I was kind of disappointed in Netanyahu. And then who else? Peres?
Peres, right.
Yeah. Well, Shimon, it's interesting. In the book, I detail what a hawk he was. He started out as a real hardliner, basically because Rabin wanted to make peace and he was trying to subvert him, compete with him. But subsequently, when Rabin was elected the second time, Peres became his wingman and, of course, pushed him on the Palestinians. Rabin's intention at first was to do Syria, not to do the Palestinians. But that's a whole other story. Peres was kind of guy who would never be denied. If you said no to him, he would hear a yes, and if it really became no, he would find another way around. If he couldn't go through the door, he'd go through the bathroom window. He was irrepressible in his determinations to try to make peace, but he never had the ability to bring the people with him, and that was a key problem. Rabin could do it, Barak couldn't, and Netanyahu wasn't prepared to try.
Well, I don't think Bibi necessarily believed Land for Peace works, but look what happened now. The Middle East, all the countries, the Sunni countries, Saudi Arabia, you have Morocco, you have other countries, that Sudan, that are now really working with Israel, and the Palestinian issue is not on the front burner for them. They're willing to make peace and work with Israel. Right. UAE, very successful.
Exactly. And by the way, it happened on Kissinger's timetable. That is to say, Kissinger said eventually they'll come to terms with Israel because they'll exhaust themselves. And we have to keep Israel strong until they exhaust themselves.
Well, what not exhaust themselves was Iran. They view Iran more of an enemy than Israel. So
that was a critical factor, I agree. But when Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, announced, and he was the one who decided on normalization, when he announced the normalization, what did he say? He said, we're tired of the conflict. And that's exactly what Kissinger expected would happen on his timetable. 40 years it took them to come around. But I agree with you. It's a great thing. What the UAE is doing in particular is terrific. And that kind of warm peace, which the Israelis have been denied for so long, has having a very positive impact on Egypt and Jordan. Egypt and Jordan kept Israel at arm's length. They had peace. They kept the peace, but they didn't want warm peace. They wanted cold peace. And it essentially is because things weren't moving on the Palestinian front, and they're, closer to.
Jordan has to worry about their Palestinian population. They're 80% of their population is Palestinian, so they're in a more precarious position than even Egypt with their population.
Not 80%, but it's certainly a majority, maybe 70%. I don't know. We don't know for sure. They don't keep census, but it's a majority. And yes, you're absolutely right. But now, very interesting. And I just had a meeting with the Jordanian foreign minister. I was in Washington. They are moving, warming up their relations with Israel, both Egypt and Jordan. Part of the reason is the cover that the Emirates and Bahrain and Sudan, Morocco are giving them. But part of the reason is also that they see what they've been missing out on. They see the way in which the Emiratis are taking advantage of Israel's incredible high-tech capabilities, and they want a piece of it. So for the years, we worked on trying to promote projects between Israel and Jordan. You remember the Red Dead Canal project? Never went anywhere. There was supposed to be a joint airport down at Eilat Aqaba, never went anywhere. Suddenly, there's this amazing project in which the Jordanians are going to build a solar farm paid for by the UAE with UAE solar technology. They're going to provide electricity to Israel. Israel is going to build a desalination plant on its coast and provide water to Jordan. And so this is a sustainable, ecologically green operation that was inconceivable before the normalization with the UAE and the others. And so I think that's a very interesting example. And lo and behold, they're now talking about putting solar farms in the West Bank to provide electricity for the Palestinian Authority as part of this overall joint project. So slowly but surely, the Palestinians are being brought into it as well.
We have a few moments left. What about Qatar? I know you had some difficulty with Qatar because at one point they were making nice with the Jewish community, with Israel. They also were coddling terrorism. Are they a factor now? You think they will jump on board, or are they too much involved with supporting Hamas and Iran?
Yeah, I think that look, Qatar was one of the first to normalize with Israel back in the 1990s when the Oslo Accords were signed, and they were the last to break with Israel, and they've always maintained a relationship with Israel, and under the table, just like the Emiratis did. And of course, when the Israelis wanted to try to buy off Hamas by providing money to Palestinians in Gaza, they went to the Qataris, and the Qataris were doing that with Israeli support. But on the other hand, as you say, they were also in bed with the Muslim Brotherhood and some bad actors. Under American insistence, they've cleaned up their act, and there's also been a change of leadership, change of generations, and the younger leaders now have a different attitude. They've been very helpful to the United States in Afghanistan, getting all those people out. They were instrumental in that.
So will they sign a peace treaty with Israel? Will you see that happening? Will they be the next one?
I don't think they're going to be the next one, but they're not going to be the last. Their attitude, I've talked to them about it and suggested that it's time for them. Their attitude is, look, we have a very good relationship with Israel. We don't need to do this normalization thing. I think they're making a mistake, but eventually they'll come around. When everybody sees the advantages of this to them, they'll sign up.
And can you credit? I think we have to credit President Trump for that, correct?
Yes. Well, I can't give him full credit. I do credit Jared Kushner and his assistant. They really did an excellent job, but it was accidental. It's not as if they did it on purpose. They were trying to make peace, just like the rest of us, with the Palestinians.
But it worked. They found an approach. Moment or two left. How do you rate President Joe Biden as far as his policy vis-a-vis Israel?
Oh, well, he's been great for Israel. I mean, I don't think that anybody can complain, especially during that Gaza conflict. The way he stood by Israel took a lot of heat from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, but he stood firm. And he's working very closely with the Israeli government on the Iran nuclear problem. And you don't hear.
But it seems like that he wants to push the Iran deal to go back and to take the genie out of the bottle. Israel's opposed to it, rightfully so. I don't think it's a good thing if they're able to get it. Now, because there's a hardline Iranian government, they may not do it, but the United States is still very hopeful, and I think it's a terrible thing if that indeed were to be the case.
Well, but look, Zev, you've then got to explain why it was such a good idea to pull out of the deal, which Trump and Netanyahu, with Netanyahu's urging, did. Because the Iranians have advanced their nuclear program under the maximum pressure of Trump's sanctions. They've advanced it almost to the nuclear threshold. Under the agreement, they were a year away from having enough.
But they were cheating throughout the whole time.
Look, that's all of that is vastly exaggerated to try to make a point. They were not cheating on the fundamental issue of enrichment. They had shipped their enriched uranium out of the country. They were under safeguards and inspections. Yes, there was serious questions about whether they were trying to develop their nuclear bomb-making capabilities that were being investigated.
And also they were able to fund the terrorist activities around the world with the money that was released.
But the point is, they are now approaching the nuclear threshold. That red line that Netanyahu.
They weren't. I think they're more vocal now. They're more active now. under this new administration because they're not afraid of America anymore. China's
Well,
afraid.
no,
Not
they were as active under Trump. They didn't stop for 1 minute, not for 1 minute, despite all these sanctions, which Biden has never lifted. All those sanctions that Trump imposed are still there. But
because
the
it's
fact
part
of
of
the matter is,
negotiations, right? That's what they're looking to do. Is he's willing to get rid of the
but if they come back into the agreement, they will have to ship out all the uranium that they've enriched. Today, they are, by the spring, according to Israeli assessments, by the spring of this year, they will be 1 week from enough material to make a nuclear bomb.
We
And
have
that
30
is because we pulled out of the agreement.
I'm not sure because I think that they've done more damage and the funding was cut for terrorism. And I believe they were still cheating. And there's nuclear plants that we don't even know about that we didn't have access to.
Well,
But
we have to disagree on that one.
we'll have to have you come back. But final question. We started by saying that nationalist Jews and more conservative Jews and religious Jews didn't really like Henry Kissinger for Islamic tag. I get the sense today he's been rehabilitated among the pro-Israel crowd or the more nationalistic crowd. Am I correct in that assessment?
Well, we'll see. What I try to show in the book, and I did not start out in this way, but what I show in the book on the basis of a deep examination of all of the archives, including the Israeli archives, is that Kissinger in many ways did fundamental things to help Israel survive and thrive. And that's not known in part because he didn't want to talk about it. But I've documented it in the book, and I think it's fair to reassess what he did for Israel because he made a great contribution. And by the way, if you look at Yitzhak Rabin's biography, you'll see that he says that too.
Ambassador Martin Indyk, thank you for joining us. I recommend the book, Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle East Diplomacy. We've got to have you back to discuss some of the important issues. So I know we took many years before you got you on. We hope you become a regular with us.
It'll be my pleasure. Thanks very much. Enjoyed it. Thank you, Zev.
Thank you for listening to Talkline Communications Network, America's leading Jewish radio and TV network since 1981. For continuous, nonstop Jewish broadcasting, please go right now online to talklinecommunications.com. For more information on all of Talkline's Jewish radio and TV shows, please call 212-769-1925 or email info@talklinecommunications.com.
Our 24-hour-day listen line is 605-562-5174. That's 24-hour-day listen line, 605-562-5174. Thank you for listening.
Great.
Anyway,